Good evening, everyone. Greetings from the Ecumenical Christian Center, Whitefield. This is the 15th lecture we have on the wider contextualized biblical hermeneutics, a certificate course through Zoom online lectures. This evening, we have Dr. S. Sobanaraj with us to take a session on Paul's Corinthian Correspondence. Before we call our speaker for this evening, I would like to introduce him to you. Dr. S. Sobanaraj belongs to the Church of South India, Kanyakumari Diocese. He finished his Doctor of Theology in the New Testament from the Synod of Serampore University in 2003. Dr. Sobanaraj had 25 years of teaching experience in Bible seminaries in India, in different places like Nagaland and in North India in Allahabad. He taught MTH and BD students for 13 years at Hindustan Bible Institute, Chennai. Currently, he is teaching at Madras Theological Seminary and College, Chennai from June 2016. He conducted several workshops for the prospective doctoral students at Satri, Serampore University on how to formulate thesis titles and thesis proposals. He published a book called Diversity in Paul's Eschatology, Paul's View on Parousia and Bodily Resurrection, published by ISBCK Delhi in 2007. It's a very interesting book to read. He also published several articles in national and international journals. While he was serving at Hindustan Bible Institute and College, Chennai, he guided over 30 MTH students in writing their theses. I hope many of them are also now completing their PhD. Since 2012, he had been serving on the executive committee of the Society for Biblical Studies in India, SBSI. He is a great academician and a great administrator. We are happy to have him this evening. So we shall now invite him for the lecture on Paul's Corinthian Correspondence. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, friends. Good evening to everybody. And it's my privilege to be part of this ongoing lectures on the biblical books. And I was thinking this is a 2-hour lectures. So I was preparing accordingly. And only a couple of days back, I came to know it is only 45 minutes. So in that way. But anyway, I have some PowerPoint material collected from here and there. But I will depend on, I may not read entire things, it will take long time. I'll try to tell some points. And it is too vast a syllabus. And of course, I will try to say. And it starts with Paul, the establishment of the Corinthian church that we have it there. And Paul established this the Corinthian church during his second missionary journey that many of us are aware of it. And during that time, so we have a historical report there, and in that connection, we need to remember something about the Corinthian situation, the Corinthian city. Its location and all is such a location is such that it was a very prosperous city, and it was the capital of this Roman province Achaia, and in that way, and its geographical location made it very prominent because of its port and things so on. So it became prosperous, and also And people, the Latin writers were also jealousy of this city's prosperity and the city's growth. The city which Paul visited was established in 44 CE, and because the Romans destroyed it 144 BC, sorry, and then it was re-established in 44 BC, and but a lot of theories are there, and it seems some of the inhabitants, even though it was claimed and the city was completely destroyed and it was no population there and so on, but the theories are that some of them were living, the local people. Later it was colonized, city was colonized, and but even though it was colonized, the Greeks were there, and Latin became very prominent language and all. And the city map is, and we can get it, the city map, and Paul's second missionary journey. And from there we get the location of Corinth, how it is located, and in between two small, these land routes, and its support and its geographical location all made things very, very convenient for the city to develop. So many outsiders came there, and they were also living there. Since the city was growing in prosperity, and it was colonized, and it was an industrial center, and with this local Corinthian bronze becoming very famous, and many floating, many people were, this passing through this city, and they were also doing business there. In that way, this city was very populous, very noisy, very prosperous, and people had everything there. In that way, this city was also known for its notoriety. This because of its economic development, and the city, and also become known for its immorality and all, which is in the recent studies, scholars are critical of it, and because Latin writers were exaggerating it, and the Roman slang against the city, in that way it is. And this Paul visited the city during his second missionary journey, and according to Acts chapter 18, 1 to 17, this Paul stayed in Corinth for at least 18 months. 18 months. It was customary for Paul to first go to the Jews and take their support and evangelize them. In that way, he found Aquila and Priscilla, who came from this Rome and who were expelled along with other Jews in Rome. So in that way, they were already Christians. So this play an important role in determining this Roman church. Aquila and Priscilla, when they came to Corinth, they were already Christians. So Paul found shelter with them, and they were also of the same trade. In that way, so Paul was able to evangelize there. Paul evangelized the city with his companion Silas, sometimes called Silvanus, and also Timothy. That report we have it in Acts chapter 18:5 and 2 Corinthians 1:19. The congregation that emerged was diverse ethnically and socially. Most of Paul's converts were Gentiles, but not all of them. Crispus, his name is mentioned, and Sosthenes had been leaders of Jewish synagogues. Even though majority of them were these Gentile people, the converts were, but there were also some Jewish people are there. And in that way, the Roman congregation was. And most of the Corinthian Christians also appear to have come from the lower classes. That is also one of the reasons for the social tensions that emerge there, but not all of them. As we have seen, Caius and all, they were not very economically very poor. And even Erastus was the city treasurer who became a Christian there. The social integration of persons from different ethnic groups and economic classes may have been one significant cause of conflict in the church. So the Roman Church was a very complex, very urban church. Urban church, of course, Paul's mission was mostly among the urban people. In that way, it was an urban church with a mixture of various rich and the poor, freed people and slaves and so on. And for our understanding, both First and Second Corinthians are the letters Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. It was the church established by Paul himself. So these letters are found as the seventh and eighth books of the New Testament canon. And the letter known to us as First Corinthians consists of the longest fully extant letter from the correspondence between Paul and the church at Corinth, founded by him. However, the Corinthian Paul had made several correspondences with the Corinthians, so that became an issue. That became a very complex one. That's why probably the title is given in that way, Paul's correspondence to the Corinthians. And so next we are going to see the Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians. This is essential to understand the letter, mainly the First Corinthians, Second Corinthians. And as we have mentioned earlier, Paul established the church during his second missionary journey. And he stayed there for 18 months that is there. And in that way, Paul stayed a longer time. And he got acquainted with the city and the people and evangelized and converted them. And many people became Christians and so on. With regard to the correspondence, the visit he made and the letters he wrote, that is a very complex one. That's why we have to look into it. And and Paul was forced to leave Corinth after 18 months because Jews, they opposed him. And in Corinth, we come across some historical data about Gallio, who was the governor appointed by the Roman Empire. And that is a record that is according to this, that's a historical one. And also Aquila and Priscilla, they came to Corinth from Rome. That is also an evidence to think about establishment of the Roman Church. The Roman Church was already there, and before they were expelled, that was around 49 CE. And so Paul was forced to leave Corinth, and he left Corinth. And sometime after that, Paul departed Corinth after a year and a half ministry there. He went to Jerusalem and later ended up staying in Ephesus for 3 years. At some time before or while he was in Ephesus, Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians. That is the letter known as previous letter, which is mentioned in chapter 1, verse 5-9. There Paul says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. This letter is asked, again people are discussing, scholars are discussing about it, whether the contents of this letter is found at least in 2 Corinthians. But that letter is suggestive that it explains about the Corinthian situation, mainly their moral laxity and the lifestyles, all those people, and the church not taking interest in correcting such people. So that was the way. So Paul was grieved and he wrote a letter. That letter is lost. After the previous letter was composed, Paul received information from the Corinthians. Please understand, before writing our canonical Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he wrote another letter known as previous letter, which he mentions in 1 Corinthians, which is found in 1 Corinthians 5:9. And after this one, that letter is lost, but it is written. It was written that Paul himself mentioned it. Then Paul received some report about the Corinthian factions, the divisions within the church from Holy's household. And he received reports of division, 1 Corinthians 1:11, not to mention other reports of sexual immorality, that hints are there. So in that way. And then also Paul met delegates, Stephanus, Fortunatus, Zacchaeus. They paid a refreshing visit, 1 Corinthians 16:17. And Paul also received a letter from the Corinthians in which he was asked about various topics. So the periday, the Greek phrase, or concerning this 1 Corinthians 7:1, and also the periday is found, this 7:25 and 8:1, 12:1, 16:1, 12, all those places. With all of these reports, letters in mind, Paul wrote his second letter to the Corinthians, which we call it, canonical name, First Corinthians. So First Corinthians was written in the aftermath of he wrote his first letter, previous letter, which was lost, which is not known to us. Then after receiving information from Holy's household about the divisions in the church, and also this receive information from the church leaders, Stephanus, Fortunatus, Zacchaeus, and so on. Then Paul wrote First Corinthians, and he probably wrote from Ephesus, not probably, mostly. The letter was composed in Ephesus around 54 to 56 AD because scholars are divided, and about Pauline chronology, it's a very complex knot. And the evidence we have is about this Claudius expelling Christians from Rome and Gallio's appointment as a Roman governor. And some of those evidences are used. Such topics as division, sexual immorality, lawsuits, marriage, Christian liberty, order of worship, and the resurrection are covered in this epistle. Paul then deployed Timothy to the church of Corinth in order to scout the situation and be a representative of Paul's teaching. We know not the details of outcome of this visit, though it is probable that it did not go well. So after writing First Corinthians, Paul sent Timothy, but Timothy's report about the Corinthian situation is not reported in the letters. So, but he sent Timothy. Timothy's visit did not and go well with the Corinthians. Timothy gave Paul an urgency to change his plans, and so he made a second visit to Corinth. This is his second visit, first visit during his missionary journey, and that is the one. And upon his return to Ephesus, Paul was provoked to write a third letter to the Corinthians. This is the so-called severe letter, which is found in 2 Corinthians. And he gave the letter to Titus to deliver it to Corinth. Paul's reasoning for writing this letter is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And there he says, he also wrote in order to test them. Paul wanted to find out whether or not they would be obedient in all things. And in that way, the discussions about Paul's correspondence with the Corinthian church, it is lengthened, it goes on and goes on. And the general understanding is that, to cut short, and being encouraged, Paul wrote, after receiving a report from Titus, Paul was encouraged. Paul wrote a fourth letter to the Corinthian church. This letter, known as 2 Corinthians, was written around 56 AD. The date is again variant. Here, Paul defends his apostolic authority, encourages the church to be unified with him, gives instructions about giving and this offering, and tells of his future plans. He mentions that Titus and others are going to make a visit. Paul also makes sure to himself is going to make his third visit to Corinth. After staying in Macedonia, he visited Greece for 3 months, making his third visit to Corinth. Acts chapter 20, verse 1 and 2. Then he went back to Macedonia and up to further ministry elsewhere. Acts chapter 20, verse 3 following. Total, Paul wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians and visited them 3 times. So totally Paul made 3 visits, and 4 letters are the previous letter mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:9 and 1 Corinthians second letter. Then the general scholarly understanding is that 2 Corinthians at least comprised of letter 3 and 4. In that way, Paul wrote 4 letters. And so methodologically, this Paul's correspondence with the Corinthian church is essential. 3 visits, 4 letters to interpret, to understand the epistle. That's why this is very important. In that way, this title is coined, I hope. Then coming back to First Corinthians, now as we look into First Corinthians is characteristically different from these letters included in Second Corinthians in a number of respects. Being not only this longest of the extant letters sent to Corinth, and the Romans is the lengthiest letter which Paul wrote, and second is First Corinthians. So to the Corinthians, Paul wrote at least 4 letters. So this First Corinthians is the lengthiest, the longest letter. And First Corinthians also has its own literary genre and function. Literary genre, literary types, and function is there. So in the recent studies on Corinthians, so much issue, so many things are being developed. First Corinthians is rich in historical information. The letter reports on the earliest history of the Corinthian church and contains some important clues to Paul's own biography and career as an apostle. It provides just enough data concerning Paul's opponents to generate a plethora of hypotheses as to the character. From First Corinthians and also Second Corinthians, we come across the false opponents. That itself is a very vast area of research and study. So many hypotheses are promoted in that way. And scholarship in the recent years has clarified many problems posed by First Corinthians. But the major challenges still need to be tackled. And these pertain to the literary and rhetorical aspects in particular. The problems of literary genre, function, and composition are still being discussed. A lot of things are going on. As we look into the letter, First Corinthians reveals that church conflict is nothing new. From this letter, we understand that the denominational politics, doctrinal disputes, liturgical preferences are not new to Corinthian Christians of the recent times or now, but it is old as Christianity itself. Paul's first letter to Corinthians is perhaps best known for some of its individual passages, mainly 1 Corinthians 13, where we have that great teaching on love, which is used on many occasions, including the wedding ceremonies. And this some think of it as the book with all that still stuff about speaking in tongues, spiritual gifts, mainly speaking in tongues. First Corinthians play a vital role. And about these things we will see under the message and section. And in First Corinthians, as we read the letter, we understand it is a letter explicitly addressed to spiritual babies. In Paul's assessment, the Corinthian Christians, even though despite their claim for lofty wisdom and knowledge and so on, in Paul's assessment, they were spiritual babies. Paul can only give them milk since they are not ready for solid food. And for one thing, these are babies who are sanctified in Christ, called to be saints, which means that Paul has high expectations of them. He wants to offer them spiritual wisdom that surpasses anything discernible through mere human wisdom. They have tremendous potential. They have the mind of Christ. They have the mind of Christ. And as we go through the content of the letter, the overview of the letter, after the customary opening and thanksgiving, Paul takes up a few matters that have been brought to his attention by some members of the church whom he refers to as Coles people. And the first chapter 1:10 to 4:21 is dealing with the divisions that was prevalent among the Christians and which was this disturbing the church. After dealing with this problem at length, Paul touches briefly on 3 other matters that Coles people probably reported to him, and about the immorality and that prevailed there. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 13. And the members of the church taking fellow believers to the court, suing them each other in secular courts. That is chapter 6, 1 to 8. And some members, events and anything goes, philosophy then justifies. And even this immorality, visiting prostitutes, such things they were justifying. And then Paul is dealing with some of the questions Corinthians sent to him. regarding marriage, that is in chapter 7. First, he considers the question of whether sexual abstinence and might not always be best policy. And then he takes up the question of whether it is appropriate for Christians to eat food and was desired, dedicated to idols. And this leads into a general discussion of Christian freedom and responsibility from chapters 8 1 to 11 1. Interposed into this later discussion is an excursus in which Paul discusses his own rights as an apostle in chapter 9 1 to 14 and his decision to waive those rights, chapter 9 15 to 27. Finally, he turns his attention to several issues that gave arisen with regard to Corinthian worship, the importance of head coverings for women, proper conduct at the Lord's Supper, and the role of spiritual gifts such as prophecy and speaking in tongues. And in while discussing about spiritual gifts, Paul highlights more about the love and its importance. Chapter 13, 1 to 13. Having addressed the questions presented to him, Paul continues to instruct the Corinthians regarding what he considered to be matters of first importance, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So this letter is on the whole very rich, having many dealing with many practical and theological issues. And as we read the letter, we understand that Paul was not, this is not a monologue. It is also a kind of dialogue. Dialogue in the sense, Paul was, Paul was asked to answer. Paul was provoked, and he was also asked to answer several questions in that way. Let's say we have points and counterpoints there. That one I have narrated it there. What Corinthians are saying, and possibly, but plausibly, and they were reasonable. And Paul's response, chapter 6, 12 is Corinthians are making a statement, all things are lawful. And they were preparing, they were making pretext to justify their, this wayward living. But Paul counterpoint is not all things are beneficial. 6:13 again, food is meant for the body and the body for food. That is, it is natural to satisfy one's appetites, the immorality they were trying to. But Paul's point is, right side, God will destroy both. That is, God will judge people who satisfy sinful appetites. And chapter 7, 1 to 5, there are people and who are promoting celibacy, saying it is well for a man not to touch a woman. That is, even married persons should practice celibacy. Paul's counterpoint is husband and wife should grant each other conjugal rights, lest there be temptation to sexual immorality. Paul's solutions and their these statements and their force and Paul's solution. Then chapter 8, 1, all of us possess knowledge. Paul's counterpoint is knowledge fills up, but love builds up. Then this chapter 14, 22 to 23, and their high regard for the tongue speaking. Tongues are a sign for unbelievers. And unbelievers who hear you speaking tongues will think that you are gracing. So Paul's counterpoint. And also like this, we have other points are also, for example, chapter 8, 4 and 8, 9, 4 and 10, 23. There we can say count these points they make and Paul making counterpoints. Some scholars also think that the words about women keeping silent in church in 1 Corinthians 14:34 to 35 describe Corinthians' own view rather than that of Paul. That's the way some of them are trying to temper down Paul's misogynistic statement that we will come to that later. Date and place are writing, we have very limited time. So Paul wrote this letter most probably in the 50s, in the middle 50s. And scholars are discussing it different now because a lot of argument and things are there. But he wrote this letter before 56 CE, and that point we need to understand. This letter was written from a basis that also we need to keep it in mind. And with regard to the occasion of the letter that we have seen, and Paul received reports, and Paul also, the Corinthians sent these questions to Paul, expecting Paul's answer. Paul sent his own representatives to visit the Corinthian church. So these occasions are very complex, not only one and several occasions are there. But anyway, Paul was forced to write this letter. Therefore, this letter is practical letter. It deals with the Corinthian situation, occasion, and the purpose of the letter is basically and this paranesis, admonition. And we have references in Paul mentioning, I am writing these things. In 1 Corinthians 4:4, he says, not to make you ashamed, but to admonish you at my beloved children. So he is urging them, conscientizing them, and not to live an immoral life, this unchristian lifestyle in that way. So basically, the purpose is edification, paralysis, admonition is part of it. Accordingly, Paul's purpose in writing to the Corinthians is clearly admonitory. He is concerned with the assembly and wants them to know what they should do and what they should not do. In 9:15, he tells them that he is not writing to them in order to gain some advantage for himself. And then after a long exhortation, which he tells the community many things about their coming together for worship. And Paul concludes his reflection with the remark that attempts to put his entire exhortation into the proper perspective, and as is a commandment of the Lord. It's a command of the Lord in that way, Paul is. And the purpose of the letter is to unite the factious Corinthian, the divided Corinthian church also. And the Corinthians were divided on several issues that also we need to know. So this letter is throwing many challenges to the present church also, how the church can come together and still work for unity within the very divisive context and environment because of socio-economic and political factors. And the major themes which, with regard to the major themes of First Corinthians, this church unity is an important theme that is emphasized throughout the letter, unity of Christians. And that is one theme that we see that Paul is highlighting more. The beginning chapters and also in chapter 11 also that there, in the context of this celebrating Lord's Supper, when the economic factors, social factors play a key role, and in this abandoning, ignoring the poor people who came to the church, while the rich enjoying the food which they brought and not willing to share with the poor in that way. And also with regard this, the unity of the church, Paul is using the famous analogy of church as a body of organism, which in my understanding is drawn from this Stoic philosophical ideals, teachings. It was Stoics who used to emphasize that, live in harmony with nature, and they use body organism as an appropriate example to effect, to bring in, to work for unity among the divisive groups, people groups, and so on. So Paul is using that analogy to highlight the unity of the church. That's why he says there is only one spirit given to all. So there, the church unity, ecclesiology is tied up with this pneumatology in that way, pneumatology, Christology. In that way, we see the anthropology, the body analogy, and all those things. So in all that, we will see that a theological web of relationships, web of relationship. It is in this letter, this the famous concept of interdependence is highlighted. That is seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 to 12, while discussing about men-women relationship in the church. Paul insists for interdependence because we depend on each other and so on, which I think is very appropriate even in the modern context. So the church unity is the focus of the book and this epistle, and also wisdom and power. And this Corinthians, when we read chapter 1, verse 4, the Corinthians were somewhat, this overconfidence, and they had a perception of that they have already obtained everything, over-realized eschatology, and they were boasting about their wisdom and so on. It is in this context Paul is, downsizing them, putting them down in chapter 1 and highlighting more about the theology of the cross, power and powerlessness, and power and weakness, and so on. Wisdom and power. Paul is troubled that Corinthians are enamored of worldly wisdom, whereas Paul is highlighting about not the wisdom of this world. And in Paul's exposition, wisdom of this world is not permanent one. It is temporal. It is temporal, temporary. In that way, Paul is now this using binaries to hold down, to make the Corinthians understand. These are all Paul's strategies. These are all Paul's strategies to convince the Corinthian believers. So in that way, we see that, so this letter is moving on. And also we see that, in this connection only, Paul highlights more about Christ crucified. Christ crucified. Paul says that when he was with Corinthians, he decided to know nothing among them except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. It is from here we have the theology of the cross concept developed, and in that way, the Corinthians, it was a pulley to the Corinthians, which they can't digest, because salvation comes from, goodness comes from the cross, which was a scandal, which was a curse in that way. But Paul says that it is the power of God and for the salvation of humanity in that way. And this Paul mocks such attitudes, addressing those whom he knows to be spiritual infants with sarcasm. Already you have this chapter 1 verse 4, chapter 4 verse 8. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Look at yourselves. He tells them you are like kings because of Christ, not like us poor apostles who have to suffer hardship for the sake of the gospel. So in that way, Paul is actually edifying them and reminding them, in a way conscientizing them, because he was asking them to stay as Christian in groups, and they were desocialized from that immoral setting of the Corinthian environment, indulgences, worldly fashions. But now he asked them to stay within the Christian in group and not to connect with the out group. Out group is completely and immoral and so on. Then in this letter we also have the famous teaching on the resurrection of the body. Paul's eschatology is a very lengthy chapter. This chapter is chapter 15. First Corinthians, we also have in chapter 7 verses 29 to 31 some glimpse of eschatology is there. In this chapter, Paul is mainly discussing about the reality of Christ's resurrection and how it is important for believers' resurrection. And Paul is connecting believers' resurrection with Christ's resurrection and emphasizing that Christ is the first fruits of this resurrection, and he is the aporke of believers' resurrection, being the aporke of believers' resurrection, first harvest, and believers' this resurrection is certain. In this, Paul discusses at length the nature of the resurrection body. Here, is a very important issue, and resurrection body is spiritual body. Unlike in the second Maccabees and all of the Jewish writings, where the same people will be resurrected again. But Paul is ruling out such thing. We will have spiritual body, a body suitable to heavenly, the spiritual sphere. And in that way, Paul is making that. And also here he mentions about something about the end events that is found in 1 Corinthians 15, 23, 24 to 28. And he mentions when the end comes, the consummation, the telos, when the telos. Before there, certain things need to be done. And those who are advocating and this speedy return of the Lord and so on, they should focus on this 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 24 to 28. In these sections, what we understand is that Jesus, our Lord, is still fighting against principalities, authorities, powers, and so on. And they all need to be defeated. And also towards the end of the chapter, our last enemy is death. Death need to be destroyed. Death need to be destroyed. After all these things only end will come, end will come. And Paul doesn't talk about second resurrection as it is claimed in book of Revelation, as some people argue, even First Corinthians, Paul talks about second resurrection. No second resurrection, only one resurrection. But Paul discusses about it, but of course it's a future language and exclusive for God. And we believers try to contemplate how the future is going to be. But Paul makes it clear that's why, and the resurrection of the body is to do with the individual eschatology also, individual eschatology and collective eschatology. First Corinthians 15, this 20 to 23, we got some hint about, and 28, 20 to 28, some hint about parousia and elements are there. That is the parousia, this collective eschatology. At the same time, and also we see that the individual eschatology elements are also there in, of course, in Second Corinthians, but in First Corinthians also in a way we can trace some elements, not much. So that resurrection of the body plays a vital role. And then we have these other themes also Paul is highlighting. And these practical matters telling. And there, the Corinthian real socio-political economic situation come to the fore, and a lot of dissension among Christians. The poor people are complaining, and their Paul is setting right how they should celebrate that one. And also in this letter, we have reference to excommunication because of the immoral attitude of some of the deliberate immoral attitude of some of the people. And sexual morality issues are discussed in this letter. And also we have the major issue of food or sacrifice to idols and whether Christians can eat or not. And this issue is discussed in Romans chapter 14, 1 to 15, this 7, that section, or 15, 13, that section also. And in Paul's perception, and Paul is nullifying the existence of devils, but he is arguing in terms of the edification of the individual believers, and those who are weak in understanding, those who are weak in their perception, and those who are strong, they have to make these adjustments, sacrifices. So here also these teachings are giving us input and a lot of insights how Christians can and tackle even present struggles, present understanding. Today, people start new denomination for doctrinal differences. When we read First Corinthians, we can halt a bit, and we can look for church unity and try to resolve some of these conflicts, some of the issues that may the root cause for these all kinds of denominational barriers, emergence of new denominations. So First Corinthians is with all its contents is throwing us many new insights and so on. So this then we have more points are there. When we look into Second Corinthians, and Second Corinthians is already we have some points we have seen, and time is the issue. And the outline of the letter is that this letter comprised at least two major letters, one letter of TAs and also letter of thanksgiving, and that we can understand from these Bibles, and they have the headings also. In this Second Corinthians, we have some important themes out there. And there now Paul is confronting. In First Corinthian, there were division within the church, they were quarreling among themselves and so on. Also the hint of outsiders, the opponents penetrate in there and disturbing the local people. Let's say we have this Apollo group, and also we have Peter group and so on, Christ party and so on. But in Second Corinthians, the attack is on against Paul. So Paul had to defend his apostolic authority. In that way, Paul had to make an apology for his ministry, defend his ministry. So one of the major themes that surfaces in Second Corinthians is Paul's ministry, and that we see Paul devotes in a major part of the letter. Paul devotes to this point. and he is defending his ministry. He and his associates are not pedalists of God's word. And he talks about his, in the context of when many ministers are self-promoters who falsify God's word. How Paul was very faithful to the word and the gospel given to him. That Paul always defends his gospel and which he received on the way to Damascus, near Damascus in that way. So in this letter, Paul defends his ministry, and Paul defends that his ministry, stresses that his ministry is of God. He has been sent by God to do God's work, and God is working to him, and in that way he is. And the work is glorious, and all he is saying. Then in this letter only we have the famous chapters of fundraising, and that is there. And chapters 8 and 9 devote on Paul's ability to raise funds, and he is raising funds to connect with the Jerusalem church, the church which was not in favor of Paul. So Paul, in this studying these two letters, we get a lot of ecumenical insights. How Paul is working, over time, and to connect with the churches which he established. Jerusalem church, of course, he didn't establish. Even the churches beyond his jurisdiction, beyond his apostolic authority, and he is creating such a scenario. So as we go through and study these two letters, we get enough hints, enough this framework for theologizing, for ecumenical theology also, and universality also, and so on. That is very much visible from the way Paul went on to collect funds and sending his representatives to collect from the people, the believers who have, to distribute to the believers who have not. So that is the way the modern missionary movements, organization, and also these other agencies who are supporting and these the many mission works and charity works, they are doing it. So in that way, Paul provides motivation for all of us. And also, fundraising is a major point in this letter. And apostolic authority, Paul is defending his apostolic authority in this letter. And Paul emphasizes and defends his authority as an apostle, because that is when we read chapter 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 9 and 10, verses 9 and 10, chapter 10. And Paul's personality was not attractive, and the way, of course, it's an apology, it's a rhetoric, you can say, or it is a polemic and so on. But still then, Paul did not present himself as an impressive personality as modern preachers, evangelists, and the so-called prophets present themselves. So Paul's this communication skill, writing, he was excellent. It was acknowledged, communication skills. So Paul had to do a lot. So this is this when we study Paul and his biography and things, his thought. And Paul is an agitative individual. Paul is an agitative individual who is very conscious to defend his authority. He is very conscious to defend his authority. This is the way, even the social identity theories, the modern concepts, social identity theories being employed to study Paul. So Paul's defense provides us a lot of input. How identity theories can be explained? It is here we come across and in group, out group. Paul is the outside is his opponents, which is a controversial issue. Who are the opponents? Several researches are done. But anyway, and with regard to the opponents, these opponents are presenting cutting size Paul's ministry, his statue, everything. It is in this context Paul has to prove that he is an in-group person. He is not an he is not trying to become an outgroup and so on. In that way, he claims to have the authority to, and he claims he has authority to excommunicate people and all those things. So he defends his apostolic authority. In 2 Corinthians, we see that his potential for a power struggle has come to fruition. That is very common as we witness in today's church. And in Paul's perception, the power struggles are a result of the church people following the worldly passions. That we have to go a long way, then we can understand these things in detail. So the power struggles are, we imitate the secular pattern, secular framework of hierarchy. where the power is accumulated with some individuals and all. In fact, Paul talks about freedom in First Corinthians, I missed it. And Paul is talking more about inner freedom, which is a Stoic idea. Stoic idea. The inner freedom enables us to get rid of these power struggles. But of course, Christianity is being human beings. Paul defends his authority, apostolic authority, and his ministry. At the same time, Paul is also providing inputs, providing a lot of clues how we can withstand in the context of power struggles where the churches are divided, churches are taken to the court, and so on. So, on the whole, by studying these two letters, we get a lot of information, practical information, even though they were written in the first century context, but they are very relevant to our 21st century situation also, where the church is struggling and to go forward, to cope with the reality of human psyche. And of course, now Paul says that it is not only human, it is also the universal powers, the principalities, the authorities, the hostile forces. In apocalyptic scheme, all these powers are the fashions of the world being controlled by satanic forces. Those forces are also disturbing the church. The church should march on in focusing on individual edification and also collective edification. So book of First Corinthians is, we can say, the book of edification. Second Corinthians also, it throws more light on how we can edify individual believers and also the community of believers. And thank you. I think I took more time now. Hello.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful talk. It was very enlightening. Such a vast book. You managed to cover it in such a short period of time for about in 40 to 50 minutes. Thank you so much. Uh, Friends, we shall now open the time to the participants for Q&A session. And some of you had already put your question in the chat box. And others also, if you have any questions, you may continue to write. Dr. Sobanaraj had discussed the social settings of the Corinthians, how Paul began his ministries or did his ministries in Corinthian church. And he discussed the literary genre and composition of First Corinthians. And he also highlighted how Paul is using the Stoic analogy and also discussed the apocalyptic and eschatological issue, which is very much seen and highlighted in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And in Second Corinthians, he highlighted how Paul defined his apostolicity and his ministries. So while the others are preparing to raise the question, so I will read a question that is being put up here in the chat box. The first question from Stephen Nanaraja is, why is that the previous letter before First Corinthians not added to the canon of Scripture?
That is a very simple question. You know that the manuscripts we have, the originals, the books, New Testament books were written in Greek language. We don't have the original manuscripts. We have the copies of the copies from second century onwards. And that's a lot of research and things going on how we can trace it. And those days writing was very expensive, very expensive, not like we have today the photocopy facilities and all. We are the most lucky people. So we should not look at the first century context through the lens of present lenses. And the churches kept, the church plays a vital role in the canonization. I used to say Bible is the church book, a church, scripture. What the church means, not only one church, several councils met and so on. So it was a long discussion. The church felt, in that context. For that matter, if you read a commentary, the New Interpreter's Bible commentary on Hebrews, there the author, I forgot the author name, he writes very nicely. In a conference meeting, not all people talk, not all people dominate, only some dominate. Unfortunately, letter to the Hebrews with rich contents, it is not able to raise its voice till recently because our Martin Luther has sidelined it. Because the Hebrews, the second baptism and so on, and in that way. So church decided found, and also those days it was very difficult. Corinth city was rocked by earthquake. Even the city which Paul visited was destroyed by earthquake later, and the documents and things got lost. So luckily they preserved it, and maybe First Corinthian, the previous letter was very coarse. So they felt, the church authority, church documents, even Modi government, I take courage to speak. Our Modi government, even the Rafale documents are disappearing in 21st century. So the first century, but then we need not politicize it because the city was destroyed, the church was destroyed, which Paul established. So we can take it lightly. It was not for them essential. And also we believe the working of the Holy Spirit. In formulating the canon that we have to, and so we have to see in that way. So it's not a major question. What is in the canon? We have enough. First Corinthian rich content, Second Corinthian also from identity issue, from ministry angle. Those who are aspire to start new denomination, it controls them. So I will say it has rich ecumenical elements for church unity. I like it. And edification, my favorite topic here, oikodomia. So I think next question.
Yes, sir. And then the second question from Stephen is, how do we address the issue of sexual immorality if it exists in the church today?
See, this is also, we are looking at Corinthian morality from 21st century concept of morality. And 21st century, with consensus, people can do anything and many things. But in first century context, it was an apocalyptic community. Apocalyptic means community which, that's why you have to read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 25 onwards. There the apocalyptic elements are coming there. And apocalyptic community, the speedy return of the Lord and the heavenly things and so on. And expectation to be with the Lord. In that context, we have to understand. So understanding that, and Paul, it was a city with all kinds of sophistication. In the COVID situation, it halted the entire world, the entire cinefield, the entire prostitution. Of course, people may not use that language in today's sex workers. And everybody it halted, even it halted our Modi. He is not able to move away from India. Otherwise, I am flying with all the luxuries. So it's a lesson, I will say that how nature is very powerful, despite our technology and many things are there. And sexual morality, Paul is in 1 Corinthians 7, conjugal rights, mutual conjugal rights is a must. He is not denying, he is not encouraging sexual abstinence in that way. Through the modern eyes, modern understanding of sex from Western import of ethical morality and all. But we need to know this Christianity began in Asia, went to West Corinthian city, where it got messed up. That doesn't mean that Christianity should imitate the Western model. We are talking about contextualization. In our situation, ethics and morality go hand in hand. Of course, OT prophets are very insisting on that one. No ethic, no morality, no religion is this. It is salt plus salt. So in that way, you have to take. So let us take it lightly in the context of COVID, this COVID-19 situation, and everybody is halted, everything is halted. In some families, they are not able to visit. I know a friend from somewhere whose life partner is held up in Chennai and not able to go because the local quarantine and for many, many months. So like that, many things are there. Okay. Okay, please, next question.
Yes, sir. The next question is from Matsumo
Yes,
Kumar. The question,
not clear.
yeah. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, little
Yeah.
sound is not there.
Paul had to keep on defending his apostleship very often. What might be the reason? To defend once is okay, but defending many times is unusual.
You see, this is to do with identity, social identity theory, I told. Identity means even all of us, we become agitated, and Biltman, I think, Biltman, Heiseman, they, someone said, Paul was an agitated individual. Agitated individual means defending his personal things. We are also, and that is, and again, of course, this is to do with psychological factors and many things are there. When what we believe that is the summum bonum, Paul was saying the gospel which he received, and when counter gospel was presented to him, and which he found it is deviating the people, and the congregations he built, even any Pentecostal pastor, how they defend their church. And CSA pastors, they may not be because 5 years they are transferred after 5 years. But the Pentecostal church, they own the church, how they defend their congregation. They are very conscious and they a lot of things like that. So this is because of the opposition also, degree of magnitude of the opposition. He faced several opponents, from several quarters. People are jealousy of it. You know the vocabulary, professional jealousy. If you are talented, smart, I have little experience. I also look tall and I speak a lot, outspoken character and all. How our smart people come together and silence and little experience is there. So professional jealousy issue we have to say. In that context again, and we have to defend the truth, that issue is there. Sometimes, this when you look at through the prophetic lens, you may not like to speak, but something in you, the spirit which is in Paul, was not keeping in low profile. So it was, even forcing him to defend. You, Paul, you are right. Why you are allowing others? Because the picture he is presenting about his opponents, they are, and they are less for money, less for position. They are not, very general and so on. Very pious, genuine people, just people. And they are intruders into Pauline territory. That also you have to say. In our Indian language, Pata land. No? And Paul's ministry is like a Pata land. Somebody from outside is coming and taking away the congregation in that context. It is natural. And Paul was, as I told you earlier, as he hinted in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 9 to 10, his speech was considered as condemned. So Apollo excelled in with the Corinthian congregation. So in such a situation, Paul had to explain certain things. And Paul was unconventional, as you are aware of it. And he was not drawing support from Corinthian church. And he was working with his own hands and earning his livelihood. But they actually, the rhetoricians, they were entitled. The preachers, they were entitled. Pastors, they were entitled to receive the offering. That's why 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where he is defending his ministry. So all these factors when we consider, so Paul is okay. Moreover, it is out-group trying to dominate the in-group. So Paul is part of the in-group, the social identity theory, is defending against the out-group who are the opponents. In that way we can say. Okay.
Okay, so thank you. The next question is from Dr. Jayashree. What are the new trends in interpreting Corinthians correspondence after the sociological interpretation of Meeks, Wayne and Meeks?
Okay, sorry. I did my MDH thesis on feminist interpretation of Paul's teaching on men and women relationship. There First Corinthian plays a vital role. I left out. I should have told more about that one, about Paul's teaching on women, and also the spiritual gifts, where the Paul's teaching us speaking in tongues. It varies, differs with Luke's account of speaking in tongues in Acts chapter 2. All these, some of the women point I didn't, because I was told it is
It takes time. Let him explain. It takes time. Let him kind of the mobile.
they talk about honor and shame issues, honor and shame issues. So I just hinted at one of the accusation against Paul was that he was not willing, he was unconventional, not drawing support from the rich Corinthians who can afford his expenditure. So that is one, and honor and the same, that issues, all these are there, and a lot of discussion going on there. So, but whatever is discussed, but we can take it in a way. The Paul is promoting church unity. Paul is working for an ethical, moral Christian community. And Paul, despite his, this defense of apostolic authority and ministry, and Paul was willing to work with others. And Paul is very categorical that Apollos and the others are co-workers, each one doing their assigned role. So those are the insights can help the church to. We may not be able to solve all the problems based on First Corinthians, but First Corinthians, Paul is making efforts, attempts, and some issues, of course, some of them are Western scholarship, but this was meant for lay people, so I didn't get into all those things. But some I should have highlighted about women teaching and all. Paul gives, this, Paul is, in Pauline schema, women have some scope. Of course, First Corinthians 14, that is contextual. We say that, it is localized text, localized text. Once it is lifted from that local Corinthian situation, it loses its, valid, it loses its power and so on. Okay.
Sure, the next question is from Silly Zones. What will you say about women's silence in the church in the present context?
Of course, lay people means this may be a new, but in academic circle, this is not so. They don't consider much. But that was a context. I was with Pentecostals also. Some kind of Pentecostal experience, everything is there. And sometimes, ecstasy. And you have to see the Hindu groups, and when they possess with the spirit, and how they do this, some of the dancing, some of the things. Our people also possess with the Holy Spirit, so-called Holy Spirit. They also do almost the same. If you see some churches, not well disciplined churches, I was part of, I used to attend. I studied in Chennai. I now also I am in Chennai, so I have some idea. I also do some research how it is, because I come from little Hindu background, so I see people how they possess the spirit, how they became abnormal and things so on. So in that context, Paul told, probably he was writing based on report, Paul was writing based on report. That's why I told, when we are interpreting such negative text, we have to see the other teachings of Paul about women. Paul encouraged women, deaconess, and so on. Paul made use of their, Paul availed the hospitality of Priscilla in Corinth, and he encouraged, even he is recommending Povey to the Roman church and so on. So Paul really encouraged women, no? Paul encouraged women deacons in that context, patriarchal setting. So Paul was a person who was not only promoting his self freedom, but he was also seeking the freedom of other people. Paul's concept of freedom is inner freedom. In a structural level, structural, hierarchical, structural level, we all come under the and patriarchy, some kind of patriarchy, some kind of hierarchical order. So in that way, we can say it was contextual. Maybe these people went beyond and they brought some disorder into the church. That happens even now also. When we go around, we can see. So that's we can take it. Okay, please continue.
Yeah, the next question from Samuel Sunit. I think this is almost the same question with the one which you are responding now. That is also in relation to women to be silent in the church. I think we'll skip this question. And then the next question is from Reverend Renoy Samuel. The question is, how many are the biblical principles presented in Corinthian correspondence are not applicable today, like celibacy of lay people, appearing in law court, women be silent, exercise spiritual gifts, etc.
Yeah, the church has traveled a long distance, and the distance in the means geographical, linguistic, economic, and political, social, so on and so forth. So the first century situation was different. I told you apocalyptic setting, the speedy return of the Lord. The book itself is giving some hint. The consummation, the end is not, before the end certain things, and in apocalyptic schema, it is periodization. Things are determined. Satan is given some time to operate, as in the book of Revelation. So the satanic forces with all the local earthly powers, they have operating time. So during that time they operate. So in that way, they were thinking the end is going to be very near and so on. So they were thinking about the piety, the spirituality, preparedness. The holiness is an important theme in First Corinthians also. The holiness, the love concept and so on. So in that way, for them, these were secondary. We have in chapter 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 29, chapter 9, 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29. The fashions of this world, they categorize in the apocalyptic schema. But unfortunately, we are immersed into that pattern, and the church has traveled a long distance, and we come across many issues. But many issues, even Jesus told, if we go to the court, we have to spend all our penny. So many issues we can settle it, we can amicably solve it. It is here the church role comes in. Church role is not to conduct programs and collecting money and spending him for several things. The church role can be in a proactive role, solving the issues the congregation faces. Of course, it's a difficult one because there is the way we can endure, we can move forward. All this can be added into the new ecclesiology, where the church has to think of not in the apocalyptic framework. It has to move away from the apocalyptic framework, keeping that one in mind, but it can expand its scope of operation. The church is surviving because of its charity works, social activities. Along with that, the church can also focus more on the ethical issues, morality. Of course, in theological circle, the morality means social ethics. And we put the admonish the church people to solve their own, amicably solve their own disputes, legal dispute. Why can't we also try? But here professionalism come to play. The lawyers are the rhetoricians and who were speaking for money in Socrates' time. Yesterday Socrates was very critical. He was talking about virtue is knowledge. Knowledge is virtue. And there, where there is no virtue, there is no, that is not knowledge. He was using dialectic and so on. So we have many things to learn from Paul's teaching also, using some of the categories. Okay, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful presentations. You uncover many things, and it was greatly insightful. Friends, I know that many of you still have your questions, and I saw some more questions, but the time compelled us to wind up our session. We are 17 minute exceeding our time limit. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful presentations, and also all the friends who raise the questions and make the session lively and engaging. I now called Dr. Johnson Thomas Kuti for announcement.
So thank you so much, Dr. Sobanaraj. So in the Indian theological circle or New Testament circle, we usually consider Dr. Sobanaraj as our big brother. So thank you for coming and giving us this wonderful presentation. And we all are blessed by your presentation. So there were around 100+ people attended this. Some came and went, okay? So in that way, about 100+ people attended your lecture. And you have done an elaborate discussion about the Corinthian Correspondence. And we are in control and in better sequence, as this is our 15th lecture. It is unbelievable, amazing that we got a larger grasp of the New Testament. Only 10 more lectures are left, and we are expecting your participation and your being with us. So Dr. Sobanaraj was giving about the background, about the visit of Paul to Corinth, Pauline correspondence, the previous letter, First Corinthians, painful letter or severe letter, Second Corinthians, and the 3 visits. And is that within 45-50 minutes, okay, he gave 1 year's information. So we are much thankful to you, and may God bless you and your ministry continually in the years come. So our next lecture is on 24th September. That is all about the prison epistles. And the person going to give us the lecture is Dr. Shufro Shekhar Sarkar, and he is the professor of New Testament at Sarambur College, West Bengal. And so we are expecting the next episode of our lecture series. And the assignment for next week is, so you all are doing excellent assignments, and we appreciate you for your great work. And that competition we all appreciate. And you are coming up with your excellent explanations and reflections. That matters a lot. And next week's assignment is Paul's involvement as a minister to solve some of the major issues in the Corinthian community. Okay, once again, Paul's involvement as a minister to solve some of the major issues in the Corinthian community and its significance in the contemporary context of ours. Okay, we will write the assignment topic later to you. Don't be confused about that. So you will get it on the, okay, what is that, our chat box, especially the WhatsApp chat box. Okay. So thank you so much. May God bless us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So much, Dr. Sobanaraj.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
God bless. Thank you.
You were,
Thank you, Dr. Sobanaraj.
yes, thank you.
Sir, I was your student in SACC. You taught us philosophy.
Okay, thank you.
You are the same. No change in you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Sobanaraj and the entire team. Thank you once again.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Anna Johnson, Anna, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, I can leave, no? No.
So Dr. Samuel Prohaga, thank you.
Okay.
Johnson, Anna.
Yes,
Thank you, Anna.
thank
We
you.
studied together in Gurukul.
Who is speaking?
Finny Babu.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. God bless.
Dr. Samuel Prohaga.
Appreciate your strong efforts to conduct this lectures. God bless.
Anna, thank you, Samuel, Anna. Happy to see you.
All Gurukul friends are here.
Yeah.